Hi guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. Today I wanted to talk about The New Me by Halle Butler, which is a very short novel that came out last month and that follows a barely employed millennial woman who just can't seem to get her shit together. This book has received some rave reviews already, with Gia Tolentino of The New Yorker calling it, quote, a definitive work of millennial fiction, while Hilary Kelly over at New York Magazine included it in her celebration of the stinky heroines of repulsive realist fiction. Kelly calls it, quote, perversely refreshing, while Tolentino says, there's pleasure in Butler's work, but it's the sick, obsessive pleasure of looking under a bandage at a wound. But while Butler's insistence on burrowing into her protagonist's worst tendencies has garnered this kind of critical acclaim, those are also the qualities of this novel that have turned off plenty of readers as well. And I have to say, my own feelings about this book swung kind of wildly between a sort of disgusted exasperation and ultimately a sort of grudging admiration, because there is a self-loathing and a mental spiraling and a lack of personal accountability to this character that is at once loathsome to me and also kind of functions as a painfully sharp mirror as well. It also got me thinking about what is millennial literature and what can we possibly learn from this trend in millennial literary novels that seem to be exploring the economic uncertainty, the soul-numbing urban malaise, and the kind of constant pressure to be self-optimizing that seems to be defining this current moment. The New Me centers on Millie, who is 30 years old, living in Chicago and attempting to hold down a temp job at a furniture showroom after many years of spotty employment. Because despite being college educated and financially supported by her parents, Millie can't seem to cobble together the basics of a stable adult life. Her face, quote, smells like a bagel, her pits are slick, her apartment increasingly resembles the bottom of a garbage can, she drinks like a fish and wastes away entire weekends and evenings watching episodes of Forensic Files on the loop, and most troublingly, she allows her entire being to bubble with this barely contained rage about her stagnant circumstances. At the furniture showroom, she has unending disdain for the minimal, menial tasks assigned to her, viewing them as beneath her, while also, paradoxically, being unable to accomplish any of them. But despite all of this, Millie hopes on some level to become a permanent long-term employee, envisioning all of the things that she can do and buy with a stable, regular salary, while simultaneously dreading the tedium and meaninglessness of it all. And while I wouldn't exactly call Millie a hustler in any sense of the word, her inability to pull herself together and to muster some excitement for the prospect of a $12 an hour paycheck is reminiscent of a recent popular article by Anne Helen Peterson called How Millennials Became the Burnout Generation, which was published in BuzzFeed earlier this year. In it, Peterson says that expectations like the ones Millie has for her own life, quote, encapsulate the millennial rearing project, in which students internalize the need to find employment that fulfills what they've been told has been the end goal of all this childhood optimization, doing work that you're passionate about. Millie's sense of what she is owed and the extent to which she is entitled to work that is both purposeful and well compensated is at odds with the reality, especially post-recession, that most jobs are in fact underpaid and unfulfilling. And so Millie is caught in this self-perpetuating vortex of real economic limitations and malaise and her own entitlement and self-pity, all of which work together to keep her stuck in place, unable and unwilling to do what's necessary to grow up and become self-sufficient. At one point, she wishes she could go back and relive her teenage and early adulthood years so she could monitor her expectations earlier and, quote, bring them way down. But like many millennials, Millie is also inundated with the idea that a fresh start is always just a yoga class or a new outfit away. She believes in the transformational power of to-do lists and entertains never-ending fantasies fantasies of self-improvement. I should read a book. I should make some friends. I should write some emails. I should go to the movies. I should get some exercise. I should unclench my muscles. I should get a hobby. I should buy a plant. I should call my exes, all of them, and ask them for advice. I should figure out why no one wants to be around me. I should start going to the same bar every night, become a regular. I should volunteer again. I should get a cat or a plant or some nice lotion or some white strips, start using a laundry service, start taking myself both more and less seriously. She seeks guidance and affirmation and that always elusive new me through self-help articles that she finds on the internet and through the consumption of all of those products and services targeted towards millennials to help them optimize their minds, bodies, careers, and lives. When Millie has a burst of optimistic energy, she will clean out her apartment or sign up for yoga classes online. But too often, her attempts to turn her life around amount to a series of false starts and short-lived quick fixes, mostly because her efforts are almost entirely fixated on her cosmetic failings and fail to address that deeper spiritual rot that is spreading inside of her. And the painful irony is that in this age when the self has become of paramount social and commercial importance, when the branded self seems to be the key to all of our successes or failures, what Millie really wants is not in fact self-improvement, but is instead a way to escape herself entirely. And in that sense, this book is a wincingly realistic portrait of someone who is struggling at the intersection of what is likely depression, self-loathing, and the false promises of her upbringing. But she's also a character who has had a great deal of opportunity as well, who doesn't have student loans to pay off, and who is almost hyperbolically coddled by parents who subsidize her rent and her shopping sprees that she indulges in whenever she goes home. So on the one hand, it is incredibly unpleasant and uncomfortable to read about this person who is trying and failing to keep their head above water, and your heart in one sense really goes out to her. But on the other hand, Millie is also allowing herself to be killed by gravity, bemoaning the hard realities of adult life, and refusing to hold herself accountable for all of the ways in which she has let herself unravel. And I ultimately admire this book because it manages to be several different things at once. It is an indictment of the false promises and expectations that millennials were raised to believe in. It is a damning portrait of millennial entitlement in the face of those unfulfilled promises. And it is also a viscerally unpleasant and empathetic account of one person hitting rock bottom. But it also got me thinking about the recent spate of novels that seem to be exploring millennials' fraught relationship with work, with urban life, and with the idea of their very selfhood. And I've been wondering how much that disaffection is in fact specific to the millennial generation, and how much of it is merely symptomatic of being a disillusioned 20 or 30-something living in the postmodern world. And it's also worth noting, as Peterson does in her article, that, quote, many of the behaviors attributed to millennials are the behaviors of a specific subset of mostly white, largely middle-class people born between 1981 and 1996, and I would broaden that to include millennials with four-year college degrees living in urban centers, which means that these trends in millennial literature are not in fact reflective of a universal millennial experience, but rather the experiences of a slice of millennials that a lot of writers and artists and critics happen to fall into. So bearing all of that in mind, one of the novels that came to mind while I was reading The New Me was Severance by Ling Ma, which is a somewhat satirical post-apocalyptic story in which Earth's population is struck by a virus that leads people to repeat the same rote tasks over and over again until they eventually expire. The gag, of course, is that these mindless zombies are not all that different from the office drones they were prior to the outbreak, and the story's protagonist, Candace Chen, is spared from the pandemic but still goes into work at her New York office building because she can't think of anything else to do, even in the midst of the end of the world. Like The New Me, Severance looks at how work in the 21st century consumes so much of our identities and how we spend our time, and yet is increasingly meaningless. A notable difference difference here is that Ma looks beyond the individual and considers the broader global effects of capitalism and its impact on not only privileged, gainfully employed New Yorkers, but also, for example, exploited factory workers in China. Chemistry by Weike Wang is another recent novel about a highly educated millennial in search of herself. The protagonist in this story drops out of her PhD program in chemistry when she realizes that science means very little to her, and like Millie, she suffers a mental and emotional breakdown of sorts and must pass through the crucible of hitting rock bottom before she can emerge as a truer version of herself. Her journey is, however, complicated by the fact that as the daughter of two Chinese immigrants, she doesn't quite have the same sense of entitlement as a character like Millie, and in fact wrestles with the tension between her own desires and her feelings of deep obligation towards the parents who have sacrificed so much for her. But the book that is perhaps the most direct spiritual sister to the new me is My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh, which is not a millennial novel at all. Although it is often misclassified as such, the disgruntled 20-something at the center of this story is living in a pre-9/11 New York City, which means that she is, in fact, solidly Gen X. Still, her sense of self-loathing and desire to both annihilate and renew herself through a year-long hibernation project is reminiscent of Millie's conflicting impulses to disappear and remake herself all at once. The relentless striving and dieting of the narrator's best friend Riva echoes Millie's attempts at self-improvement and suggests that this narrative of achieving your best self is less generational than it is perhaps a product of mass culture and commercial manipulation. The narrator of My Year of Rest and Relaxation also binges Whoopi Goldberg VHS tapes, much in the same way that Millie binges episodes of Forensic Files, both of them filling the void of modern life with cheap distractions. And although Moshfegh herself, born in 1981, technically squeaks into the millennial category, I think her novel is evidence that these themes of alienation and urban ennui and the use of commercial consumption as a sort of synthetic placeholder for greater meaning are certainly nothing new. These are, in fact, trends that you see in foreign literature as well, where Western notions of generations and generational traits start to get a little bit murky. PAVANE for a Dead Princess by Park Min-gyu is set in 1980s South Korea, and its characters in a different country in a different decade are dealing with the same deadening urban apathy and meaningless jobs that we have come to think encapsulate the millennial experience. These characters' woes are in many ways very specific to the culture and values of 1980s Seoul, but again, there are aspects of their despondency that seem not specific to any particular generation or nation, but rather as a broader symptom of living in a first world post-industrial society. The one recent book that seems to stand in contrast to all of these novels is Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata, which, coming out of Japan, again doesn't quite map onto Western notions of generational divides. But it does consider a lot of these same themes, and often from a different and surprising kind of angle. Its protagonist is Kiko, a 36-year-old convenience store worker who, in contrast to all of these other characters, finds a great deal of meaning and fulfillment being a part of the bigger capitalist machine. Kiko is genuinely content with the relative meaninglessness of her life. She doesn't strive for anything she can't have, and in this way, unlike Millie, she refuses to be killed by gravity. And on the one hand, Kiko's submission to being a cog in the machinery of modern life might seem sad or unsettling, but on the other hand, it is also quite radical. And I have to say, without getting into explicit spoilers, the ending of The New Me seems to be spiritually in line with Convenience Store Woman. And in its final moments, it seems that Millie has adopted some of Kiko's worldview, although it is perhaps slightly ambiguous as to whether or not that constitutes a happy or sad ending. So all that's to say, I found The New Me by Halle Butler to be a very worthwhile read despite my initial doubts about it. If you're sick of reading about entitled Untitled Millennials, you might want to skip this one. But either way, I would love to hear your thoughts about recent trends in millennial literature, what millennial fiction even is, and whether or not millennial burnout is just a new variation on the ennui and world weariness experienced by many generations past. As always, thanks so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time. Bye!